Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want us to remember why we are here. The reason we are here right now debating this issue is because the Democrat majority last year failed to pass a budget. Didn't pass a budget, didn't pass a single appropriation bill. This is a $3.7 trillion enterprise called the federal government. Last year, we didn't pass a budget, we didn't pass a single appropriation bill. And so this is cleaning up the unfinished business of last year. And it was always said, well, we couldn't do this before the election. So when the election was over with, instead of dealing with these important budget issues, we did a START treaty, which was, of course, important to debate. Don't Ask, Don't Tell, DREAM Act, all kinds of other things, but never the budget. We didn't deal with the budget. And so here we are, dealing with last year's unfinished business. So when my colleagues come in here and make all these arguments about how terrible it is that we're having to do this, and the House Republicans have sent us this budget that saves $60 billion from last year's spending levels, the reason we're having to go through this exercise in the first place is because last year the Democrat majority didn't even pass a budget. Now, where does that leave us today? Well, we all know that we've got a $14 trillion debt. $14 trillion. I think that has sunk in with the American people. And to put that into perspective, historically, this last month, the month of February, our debt was $223 billion, our deficit. In other words, what we added to the debt. $223 billion in 1 month, the largest single month total ever. Now, we've added more to the debt last month than we did from the founding of our country until 1945 in just 1 month. Now, the projected deficit for this entire year is $1.65 trillion, the largest ever in nominal terms, and OMB predicts it to be the largest as a share of our economy since World War II. That's as much debt as we ran up from the founding of our country until 1985. This is the dimension of the problem that we're dealing with. Now, there's an old saying that if you're in a hole, stop digging. Well, we continue to dig the hole deeper and deeper and deeper. So we're going to have votes today on a couple of alternatives. One is the alternative that was sent over from the House of Representatives, which shaved $60 billion off of last year's spending level. And so there are lots of people coming down here, and there's all kinds of gnashing of teeth and how draconian these various cuts are going to be. $60 billion, remember, on a $3.7 trillion budget is less than 2%. Now, to the average American, if they were, like we are at the federal level, out of every dollar they spend, borrowing over 40 cents and running $1.5 and $1.6 trillion deficits year over year over year, I think they would figure out a way how to tighten their belts a little bit and be able to absorb a 1.5% cut over last year's spending level. Now, couple that with the fact that since 2008, spending has increased by 22%. Non-defense discretionary spending, which is what we're talking about here, has gone up 22%, 10 times the rate of inflation. All we're talking about here is going back to 2008 levels. This isn't draconian, Mr. President. I think the American people think that this is reasonable. So what does the other side put forward? The other side said, well, we think this is draconian, and so we're going to put forward a proposal that cuts $4.7 billion. $4.7 billion compared to $60 billion. $4.7 billion is what the other side puts on the table in terms of spending reduction in trying to do something about a runaway federal debt. Well, if you look at the clock today, it's 2:45 p.m. By this time tomorrow, 2:45 p.m. tomorrow, we will have added over $4 billion to the debt, almost as much as they're proposing to save for the balance of this entire year. So they're laying forward savings of $4.7 billion for the rest of the fiscal year, when between now and this time tomorrow, we will add over $4 billion to the federal debt. That's the dimension, Mr. President, of what we're talking about. It's so bad that former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan said recently that he views the probability or the possibility of a debt crisis occurring in the next two to 3 years to be 50%. Debt crisis. Now, if that's not enough, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military official in this country, Admiral Mike Mullen, said a few months back that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Now, how much more do we have to hear? It's not just a threat to our future, to future generations. It's a threat to our national security, and it's a threat to our economy, Mr. President. You have all kinds of evidence out there that this level of spending and this amount of debt costs jobs in our economy. Now, everybody says the most important thing that we want to focus on is the economy and job creation. I agree with that. Well, one of the best ways to do that is to start getting spending and debt under control. There's a great body of research out there that studied the last 8 centuries of governments and concluded that when your gross debt reaches the 90% level of your total economy, in other words, gross debt to GDP equals 90%, that it costs you about 1 percentage point of economic growth every year. Well, according to Christina Romer, the former economic advisor to the President, every time you lose 1 percentage point of economic growth, you lose 1 million jobs. So if we continue to sustain this level of debt, it is costing us economic growth, which is costing us literally jobs every single day. Now, the Government Accountability Office here a couple of weeks ago issued a report, and in it they looked at the government and the various agencies of government and how much it costs and looked for duplication and redundancy and inefficiency. And what did they conclude? They concluded that there are 82 programs in this country across 10 different agencies or departments of government that are designed to improve teacher quality. Now, granted, a very noble goal, but does it really take 82 federal programs and 10 agencies or departments to administer programs improving teacher quality? There are 56 federal programs out there which teach people how to manage their finances. Now, when you're running a $14 trillion debt, arguably, this is probably the last place it ought to be advising people about managing their finances. But 56 federal programs? I mean, the American people have got to be looking at this, and it's incomprehensible to them, I think, to see what their federal government wastes money on. And so what we're talking about here is a fairly reasonable reduction in non-defense, non-national security discretionary spending. And I think that, I hope today that we will take a step forward and demonstrate that we are serious about this. What the Democrats put forward, $4.7 billion, Mr. President, it just isn't serious. It completely ignores and appears to be in denial of the dimensions of this problem, which I think are fully grasped by the American people. In fact, we had testimony yesterday in front of the Senate Budget Committee from Erskine Bowles and Senator Al Simpson, who headed the Debt Commission, who said this is the most predictable crisis we've ever had. We see it coming. We know it's coming. We can do something about it, and we are trying to today. It is about jobs, Mr. President. Now, people have gotten up on the other side and said, well, it's going to cut this or cut that. The majority leader got up yesterday and said, we can't do this because it would cut funding for the Cowboy Poetry Festival. Now, when you're, out of every dollar you're spending, borrowing more than 40 cents, when you're running a $14 trillion debt, there are priorities, arguable, that are important in terms of federal priorities. I don't think that probably counts as one of them. I don't think the American people would think so either. The senator from Montana just got up and said, well, this is going to cut people from Medicare Advantage. Well, what about the health care reform bill last year? That cut $200 billion from Medicare Advantage and would leave literally a quarter of those people who get benefits under Medicare Advantage without that coverage today. I mean, that wasn't a big talking point for the other side when we were doing health care reform last year. And yet today, again, it's a typical rhetorical scare tactics. But what I would remind my colleagues and remind the American people is that over the last 2 years, spending has increased, non-defense discretionary spending has increased 22%. All we're talking about is going back to 2008 levels. Since that time, it's increased 10 times the rate of inflation. We need to start living with our means. We cannot continue to spend money we don't have, Mr. President, and I hope that my colleagues will support H.R. 1 and let the American people know that we are serious about getting our fiscal house in order. I yield the floor.